Hey guys, happy Monday. We are continuing our conversation on prayer, and we're in this spiritual disciplines series where we're talking about some practical things about the disciplines of our spiritual lives and how we incorporate and intentionally look to build our relationship with God around core practices that connect us in sort of real, tangible ways to the church as it's existed throughout the centuries. And so we're looking at things and practices, and we're considering how we live this out and what it looks like, and where the Spirit is prompting and poking and pointing at us to be specifically intentional about these habits that we want to develop and continue to develop in our lives. And prayer, I think, is probably the first and most poignant. Now, if you're reading the article and not just watching the video, I said this: prayer is about posture, perspective, presence, power, and petition, and probably in that order. And what's in mind for me as I think through that is like the Lord's Prayer. And the consistent example we see of people like Daniel. And so I want to highlight some of these things by looking at examples I've mentioned. And let's talk about this. So number one, posture. If we look at Daniel's life and we look at the example that Daniel gives us, I'm thinking most poignantly of our story, Daniel in the lion's den. The king of Persia has issued a decree. You're only supposed to pray to him. And immediately upon hearing the decree, Daniel goes to his house, opens the windows facing Jerusalem. Posture. He's present now to where the Lord has been present with Israel, right? He's posturing himself. He's framing his physical space in such a way, and he's focused on his prayer that faces west toward Jerusalem. And there's a couple of really cool Old Testament theming things going on in there. Nothing good ever happens in the East in the Old Testament. Something from the East or something going East, something bad's going to happen. And so Daniel now has turned and he's faced west. He's facing Jerusalem, and he's facing the space where God used to inhabit. He's facing the space he knows has housed the presence of God. And he probably, I don't remember if the text mentions it explicitly or not, he's on his knees. It's a traditional manner of prayer. And so he's postured himself in this way. Jesus is another great example of posture. He goes in the Garden of Eden away from his disciples, and he prays on his knees, considering the will of his Father and what is about to happen and transpire on the cross. Moses, up on the mountainside and encountering the presence of God, he in the burning bush, he takes off his sandals. He's standing on holy ground. There's a posture element to prayer that matters. Part of that posture involves how we present ourselves before the Lord. There's an element in biblical storylines and in biblical storytelling and in the way that the Bible frames it that looks like coming before a king, right? And being humble in our posturing and our position, bowing, which is a lot of the reason why we bow our heads and we fold our hands, and we find ourselves in this position, this posture that recognizes physically, and in some cases, like Jesus, geographically, as they move to certain places and spaces in the storyline, that our posture leads us directly into our perspective, the way we position ourselves before God in prayer, submission, reliance on God for what he is about to do, our humility in bringing ourselves before him. We don't talk about bringing God before us. We talk about bringing ourselves before God because we consider him to be greater, to be the sovereign, to be the one that's in control. And so we acknowledge God. We acknowledge his power. We acknowledge his sovereignty. the fact that he cares and concerns and he wants to listen and hear from us. But this all starts to shape, or it should start to shape, our perspective. And so part of what has to happen in prayer not only is a posture, a placement of ourselves that's conducive to healthy and vibrant time in conversation and in prayer, in speaking and in listening with God, but also a reminder in what we say and how we say it, of who we're talking to and how we think about that God that we talk to. If we go and we analyze our prayers, and this is something I try and do on a regular basis, do I spend most of my time coming before him with my list of requests and demands, or do I spend time before him focused on who he is and what he's doing and why it matters? Am I paying attention to that, or am I just paying attention to the things I need him to do or to meet or to solve because they're problems that I can't fix, and life would be a lot more convenient if he would just fix it for me? Because you see, there's another layer to this. David is consistent about this in the Psalms. He's constantly telling God what it's like and what God is doing. And often in the Psalms, there's this echo that follows the way David really feels in all of his frustration. That's praise. We see it most clearly in Psalm 22. It's called the Crucifixion Psalm, where David describes his current situation and anguish in terms that sound a lot like Jesus' crucifixion. It's actually really cool. And then the back half of that psalm is all about praise for what God has yet to do. And that's about this idea in perspective. Prayer shouldn't just change our perspective because, oh yeah, we believe God will answer my requests. Prayer should change my perspective because prayer should be about a conversation with God, not just directed at God. And this is critical from the book of Job. Job speaks with God. He wants to talk to God. He wants an answer from God. And Job's friends talk about God. Job's perspective will shift as the book develops, but it shifts because Job is talking with God. He's postured himself. He's creating a perspective that acknowledges who God is. And that's the tension in Job. Knowing who God is, Job can't make sense of what God's doing. And sometimes we can, and sometimes, like Job, we can't. But because Job has a perspective on God as a person he's engaged with, there's room for God to speak and Job to listen. Because Job is postured humbly before him, there's a space and a place for Job's perspective to be on the Lord, for his posture to be reverent and submitted to the authority of God. Next, we have to recognize the presence of the God we are in. And this here is the tension, and it's the bridge from this early section of posture and presence, or posture and perspective, to the next in power and petition. And that's really this. The presence of the God we are in is simultaneously in awe that we are allowed to be in the presence of the holy God who created the universe, and intimate with our Heavenly Father. We don't just attempt to be in his presence to make our requests. We attempt to be in his presence because he's our Heavenly Father. There's a reality here that it's not just the God of the universe we get to speak with and listen to when it comes to prayer. It's a Father who created us and loves us. And while we are humble and surrendered and cautious about coming before the creator of the universe, the cosmic judge, and the king who is sovereign at all times, we also recognize that individual has called us his children. He has brought us into his family. And like any father wants to give their children good things and be with them, so too God. In fact, he wanted so intently to be rightly related to us again that God the Son became one of us and modeled how we relate to the Father and showed us how the Father wants to relate to us. Because it's not just about the presence of the King. It's about the presence of the Father. And so we have this posture and perspective. We bask, we sit in, we enjoy the presence of our Father in heaven. We recognize his power. He can, at a moment, change everything. And that change can make life dramatically easier or much more complicated. It can look like the blessing on Abraham, and it can look like the struggles of Job. Sometimes it can look like both simultaneously. But here his power is framed in the tension between God as sovereign King and loving, gracious Father. And we remember that power for our best. Romans chapter 8, all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. And we remember that he has the power to change it. But he will take care of our needs according to his will. And so even if it doesn't work out the way that we want, or it's not going the way that we think it ought, we remember that our good Heavenly Father isn't intending something for our destruction, but will bring about something in our best interest. And only now are we ready to discuss our petitions. And what we might find is that being intentional about our perspective and our posture, our time in his presence and the power he possesses as the King of the universe and our good and loving Father, now our petition might change. Now we might find ourselves more willing to ask that his kingdom and his will be made real and manifest and tangible. Or we might ask that ours be heard, but his will prevail. And we might find ourselves asking that if our request can't be granted in the way that we want, for him to be at work in changing our heart, our attitude, our understanding, our insistence into something that's more yielded. And see, here I think we get to the heart of Christian prayer. Our posture, our perspective, and our time in the presence of God, I think should bring us to a place where we are ready to be yielded to the Spirit, obedient to the will of God, and acknowledging the example and the challenge of his Son. You see, here we expose ourselves to the will and the love of our good Father by following the example and the pattern that Jesus has given. In praying like he prays, and we allow the Spirit to be at work. But this requires that we surrender. And prayer, I think real biblical prayer, is about yielding to the Spirit and the will of the Father by following the example of the Son. I'll see you next time.